So I'm going to, Jonica's going to tell us all about her book. I have been really, really enjoying it. It's very inspiring and quite exciting. Even, you know, most of it I know about, but it's still super exciting. I think the part about the school strikers was like, I was like, yeah, it was inspiring. So I think everybody will get a lot out of the book, and even if you're a super experienced climate activist. So Jonica, could you please tell us what was a trigger for you to be overwhelmed by climate grief and how that led to writing this book?
Absolutely. Well, I never expected that I would be writing a book, let alone a book like this. But look, I'm a science reporter. As you mentioned, I was on Catalyst for 20 years. So I thought I knew a thing or two about climate change, right? But it turned out that I only understood it intellectually. It hadn't really hit me emotionally until very recently. And the reason was, look, we all have places that we fall in love with, right? Like we fall in love with people. I call them heart places. And you can love more than one place, like you can love more than one person. And one of my heart places is the snow. And I fell in love with snow well before I met snow, because I grew up in Western Australia. But snow is just awful. It's all through our fairy tales. It's you know, Lord of the Rings. Imagine if that was set in Fiji. It just doesn't have the same grandeur. So to me, snow always suggested enchantment and magic and all the imaginative possibilities in the world. And then when I moved to the eastern states, I got to fall in love with a real snow place, Kunamanamaji, which is Australia's snowy mountains. And look, they're every bit as amazing and gorgeous as anything in Lord of the Rings. I mean, you've got these wombats that make little snow caves. You've got pygmy possums that, you know, lie through winter under a blanket of snow. You've got the snow gums. They're like nothing else on earth. You know, their trunks twist and turn with these jewel colors of red and gold and silver, and then their leaves spread out and become ice rimed, and they glitter in the sun like chandeliers. So there's everything magical about our world in snow. And then in 2017, 2018, through a series of circumstances, I suddenly went, it was when the Great Barrier Reef died, actually, and I happened to be in Japan in the snow, and I just suddenly looked around and went, oh my God, this could happen to snow, you know? And I got home and I started researching it. I spent about a year researching what was going to happen to snow, and sometime during that time, so we're at 2018 now, I just started to cry. And I would say I cried on and off for months. I mean, and I fell into a really profound depression, most unexpected, to the point where I actually, for the first time in my life, sought antidepressants. So we're talking a pretty serious collapse on my part. I found my own ways through it, but, and that was such a private thing. But in 2019, I started hearing similar stories from other people, not about the snow, but about other things. And I suddenly thought, God, I'm not the only one struggling with this. And I'm a science reporter. Maybe I can go on this mission and ask experts, but surprising people too, about what their what their experience was, and that I would share whatever I found with the rest of us. And that's what became the book. Hello?
Yes. Thank you. Sorry, I had myself on
mute. Out there.
I was on mute. The old classic mute. Thank you. So on your journey through the book, like, it's an amazing amount of research and amazing journey of speaking to all sorts of people from different backgrounds. So people like Missy Higgins, the comedian Charlie Pickering, psychologists. So you've got through the book, go through a whole lot of strategies for navigating these emotions that come through with courage, motivation, and active hope. So let's explore some of these. Could you explain why courage was such a big part of the book?
Sure. Well, I should backtrack and say that by this stage, I was having trouble with hope. Like, I know you're supposed to hope. Without hope, you know, we basically fall apart. But I was starting to mistrust hope because my hopes kept being dashed, especially when, you know, we might elect people who are full-blown climate deniers. And I was finding this was really compounding that overwhelm. And then I was listening to a podcast again in 2019, and I heard Anna Rose, who I think is familiar to some of you, and she started talking about courage. And it was just this light bulb moment. It was like, of course, when your hopes are temporarily dashed, that's what you can fall back on, is courage. And it's such a fantastic word. There's a reason this word was used so much in World War II in my own family, for example. I reflect on my grandparents' war, but it's a word that you can whisper yourself, and it's amazingly encouraging to say courage. You know, you don't have to be particularly brave. You can just say that word. And the other thing that's so beautiful about it, that Anna Rose describes wonderfully, is that it's made of these two French words, cœur, which means heart, and rage, which means anger or fight. So basically, courage is the heart to fight for what.
Well, hopefully we'll get Jonica back.
And the other great thing about courage, courage is contagious. You get one person stepping forward and showing courage, and the rest of us have the courage to do it too.
Beautiful, thank you. Sorry, it just cut out briefly in the middle there, but I think we caught everything you said. So the story is quite dramatic at times in the book. And there's a lot of really helpful advice from all those different experts and people along the way. What would you say, Jonica, has been the most helpful for you, advice for you in your dealing with climate grief and anxiety? And Missy Higgins, I know, like, that was a very powerful chapter and you really resonated with her.
Absolutely. Yeah. Do tell me if it drops out again. And I'm sorry about that. I'm in Western Australia. But it's interesting, you know, people can ask that really glib question, how do I get over my climate grief? And it's like, well, there's no one thing, right? There's a whole lot of other things that separately come together to sort of pull you through emotions. And again, it's not even something that you get over, right? It's something that you learn to process, harness, live with. So Missy Higgins, she had this beautiful, soulful conversation with me. You know, if I didn't love her before.
Oh, have we lost you again, Jonica?
One that resonated with me is about having a healthy information diet, because it's so easy for us to just keep reading the news and looking at the news, and news by definition, it's always bad. It's always there to push your fear buttons. It drowns you in a soup of anxiety. So you have to be really mindful going forward about how much of that you take on board, and really balancing it out every day, certainly every week, but probably every day, with good news, with looking for heroes, with looking for the positives that are happening. Otherwise you get this really paralyzing soup of anxiety. What else? There was an algorithm that I'll just mention briefly, because I know that Susie Burke will be talking about this more. But when I put together something that I spoke to a lot of psychologists for this memoir as well. And I sort of boiled down to step one, you name and validate the emotion. And I think even just acknowledging that there's such a thing as climate grief, and it's really profound, is so important. And that was one of my aims for the book. So first, you name and validate the emotion. Second, you change what you can. Third, you accept what you can't. And I'll let Susie talk a bit more about that. Look, there were many things. Charlie Pickering, we talked a lot about the importance of humour. So there's a whole chapter on humour. Now, you don't see enough of that in climate books, in my opinion. But laughter evolved for a very profound reason. You know, we don't all laugh all the time, unless evolution thought it was really important that we do so. And when you look at laughter, it's what we're even impelled to make stupid jokes when we lose our house. You know, I spoke to people in this, I had friends and family members and so on, who had their houses threatened or lost. And you make jokes about it afterwards. And it's a way of relieving the stress, because what does laughter do? It releases oxytocin, which bonds us with those that we're laughing with, and it reduces all the stress. So it's really powerful. But then, of course, I think the biggest strategy, and look, there's so many in the book, but probably the one we were going to talk about next is active hope. And this comes back to that issue with hope, that ordinary hope seems a bit much like wishful thinking, particularly when the hope feels uncertain, you know, up and down. But active hope is this, there's lots of different words for it, but it's outlined by the philosopher Joanna Macy. And essentially, here's my sort of simplistic take on it. You have a realistic view. You don't go into denial. You have a realistic view of what the future could bring. But you also have in your mind a parallel vision of the future, which is the best future you can imagine from this point, the future that you choose, if you like. And so active hope is the action. It's not some sort of vague belief. It's the action that you offer as a gift to bring about this best possible future. So if you like, my book in a way was one of my gifts of active hope. It was that hopefully by putting all this together, people would also be able to go through the journey and some of the strategies that I found to try and keep my sanity in this sometimes weird world. And the other things that are lovely about the notion of active hope is, one is that you're supposed to catch an inspiring vision, which is really lovely. But the other is to see the grief as just the start point of a call to adventure. And I'm someone who loves Lord of the Rings and all those kind of epic narrative fictions. So they actually appear, there's a lot of gratuitous references to Lord of the Rings and in this book. But it is such a lovely way of casting it. I mean, we've all read those kind of stories, and the idea that this is all a call to adventure kind of reframes the whole thing, and I think puts a really positive slant on it. And you can ask yourself, what would Frodo do? You know?
Absolutely. And this idea of active hope, I think, is one of the most important things in the book, actually, about the difference between a kind of wishful thinking, like you were saying, that sort of hope, oh, I'm sure everything will turn out to be the best, you know, work out for the best in the end, which is quite different from a more, I deeply care about this, so I'm going to put my energy in to try and do something about it. That's what active hope is, regardless of the outcome.
That's right.
Yeah, so it's very, it's vital that we do it. And I noticed in your book, I think in the chapter called Courage, which was about interviewing Anna Rose, she said something to that effect of, I'm too busy getting active and doing stuff to be, you know, dwelling in overwhelm, or, you know, or even thinking about the future. It's like we're just being present by being in active hope.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's really cool.
Yes, thank you. So now, Jonica, I believe you've got a reading for us from one of the really most dramatic parts of the book. So the book, as for those who haven't read it, follows the story. A lot of the book, it follows the bushfires that of the Australian bushfires the summer before last. And so that is one of the moments of the book, and Jonica's going to read it out for us.
Yes, so I think I cut out earlier when I was trying to explain how the book became quite such a personal memoir, because it was never meant to be. I thought originally that I would just use, you know, my story as chapter 1, the snow story, and then I'd go and ask all these people and there'd just be different stories. But because I started writing this in October 2019, and look, this book was about, you know, the emotions and climate change, all of a sudden the whole thing was just escalating. I mean, literally, I think most of us felt like we'd fallen into the plot of a film. So, you know, which apocalypse are we in today? So the book took this really dramatic turn and became this epic journey narrative. And just when I thought things couldn't escalate more, because I live on the south coast, New South Wales, so, you know, we were in smoke for 3 months, and the fires were like some biblical beast stalking up and down the land. Just when I thought things couldn't escalate further, my mum's town of Malakuta was hit on New Year's Eve. And so this is from the chapter that I wrote where I just went down as soon as I could get into Malakuta and asked a whole lot of mum's friends about what it was like to be there. So there were no one special, they were just ordinary people. And then I put together the narrative. So this is what Nicholas, hang on, I just got the wrong page there, but this is what Nicholas happened to him. And he's a 30-year-old, and he decided to stay and defend. And most people in Malakuta were told not to, because the fire are not going to come and rescue them. So here's Nicholas trying to defend his home. Unexpectedly on his own, fortified with the desire to protect the life he's built, Nicholas enters survival mode, running up and down the street, fighting spot fires with buckets of water, occasionally a hose. At one point, a power line came down on the road out in front of my house, and it all started sparking. And then everything was blazing behind me, and then everything was on front of me was on fire as well. And I just thought, well, I can't go inside the house because all the houses are burning. And then I thought, well, if things get too bad, I'll just zip down to the beach on my bike and I'll kind of hide under the cliff face. That was my genius plan. Good one, I nod. It worked. Well, not really, he laughs. So I jumped on my bike and then I head to the beach. Like a scene from a movie, he pedals like the wind down a corridor of fire. All the houses ablaze, all the tea trees ablaze, flames flying 4 times their height, fireballs arcing overhead. It was just raging through the air, he says, and I get there and there's a staircase that goes down onto the beach, and that was on fire. And I ditched my bike and then I ran down the burning stairs, but the fire actually came down the cliff face and the beach was on fire. All the tussocks, and I saw them start burning down the beach and heading into town, and I was like, holy shit. And I couldn't go that way, and it was burning down the cliff face, so I ran to where the boat ramp is. I got up to the top of my bike, it was burnt to a crisp, and then another front came through, but on the other side, and it went all the way down to the boat ramp, and I was kind of stuck in the middle then, so I had to run through the golf course. My jaw is on the floor as Nicholas describes running from the flames, ending up doing a 2-kilometre high-speed loop around the back of the firefront to the other end of Terra Nova Drive, checking in with his father-in-law, then sprinting back to his end to pick up a bucket where, if anything, conditions are worse. There was fire everywhere. Pretty much every fence was on fire, and then the bushes, trees, houses, and then it kind of escalated. Houses would catch on fire, and then the next house would catch on fire. Everything at that time was just chaos. Amid this sensory and emotional overload, with 10 houses burning around him, Nicholas's brain encodes a new knowledge, the dreadful keening sound a home makes just before it dies. It starts chuffing, like it's burning on the inside. It starts chuffing and you can see it. The windows start to bend, and then bam, the windows pop, and it just explodes like a friggin' bomb. And then just the thought in your head, like the animals, all the trees. Nicholas looks up grieving. It's like all the things, the beauty this place has to offer is burning in front of you, and it's out of your control, you know? There's nothing, really. You're just a person with 2 buckets. The reason I love that story, and I only really noticed how powerful it was when I started doing readings for the book, is just what a powerful metaphor it is to finish with, because he's just a person with 2 buckets, and it just made me realise when it comes to climate change, we're all just a person with 2 buckets, you know. Some people have got really big buckets, you know. Adam Rose is amazing. She's got really big buckets. You've got Mike Cannon-Brookes, who's also in the book, because it's bringing his billions of dollars to you know, bringing real economic change into the renewables future. You've got the climate strike kids who, you know, had amazing impact, but most of us just have a little impact. But that's okay. We just bring our 2 buckets. And, you know, Nicholas, he saved his house with those 2 buckets. He might not have, but he did. And he saved 5 other houses as well. And, you know, later in the book, there's a quote from Candy, which says, whatever you do will be insignificant, but it's essential that you do it. And I think everyone has just, when I've told this story, just found that so clarifying and empowering. It's like, yeah, we do what we can. You know, it's like, what would you do to save the one you love? You just do whatever you can. So there you go.
Thank you. Beautiful. Okay. Jonica, we're almost out of time, but any last message or key message that you'd like people to take from the book?
Yeah, well, first of all, I hope they really enjoy it, because one of the reasons to write a book like this is a lot of the books are really, most of the books, let's face it, are really fact-based, and I'm someone who likes reading stories. So this is very much written as a sort of epic narrative arc. But that's what happened in real life anyway. I mean, it seemed like we were living in some kind of movie. So, you know, I hope it's a book that you can really get swept up in the story, but also process, because it's a memoir, a personal journey. You can also, you know, process things for yourself as you're coming along with me, trying to process it. And something, you know, you might find something different to me in what on the people I talk to, and I hope that there's something there for everyone. I want people to know that they're not alone in struggling with these feelings, because I think that just makes such a difference for us for processing this anyway. I think another big takeout is that the disasters have shown us that when the chips are down, 80% of us actually turn to the pro-social emotions. You know, yes, we've got the sociopaths, but the majority of us actually are just overwhelmed by an urge to help, contribute, and do whatever we can for others. And we're proud of being part of a community that pulls together. You know, this notion of pride is so important. It's an emotion that evolved to make us work together to do the really hard stuff. And finally, I would say, don't be afraid of the emotions. You know, grief is important. Grief honors what you love, and you won't get trapped there. You know, the philosopher Joanna Macy talks about it being Drano for the soul. She says, like, it will wash through you and give you, and you'll be able to transform that into courage and action and meaning.
Oh, thanks, Jonica, and thank you for writing such a beautiful book. And, you know, as a seasoned climate activist, I got a lot out of it myself, and I think all of you, everyone here tonight, will as well, if you go get yourself a copy. So I should have said at the beginning, we're going to have plenty of time for questions at the end after the 3 speakers. So after that, so save up your questions and we'll get you to put them in the chat at the end of our three speakers. So thanks, Jonica, and we'll come back with some questions for you after. So our next speaker is Jazz. So Jasmine Botel, she is otherwise known as Jazz, is a Year 12 student from Sydney's Northern Beaches and one of the organisers of the Sydney climate strike. She got involved with the school strike for climate a year ago during the COVID lockdown. She's been wanting to vote since she was 16 and is excited to be able to exercise this right at the next election, which is coming up soon. So welcome, Jazz. Thank you so much for being here, and I'll hand over to you.
Yes, so I am Jazz and I am 17, and as was said by Susie, I am a Northern Beaches school striker. Before I begin, I would like to acknowledge the Gadigal people whose land I am on today. I want to pay my respects to the traditional caretakers of the land, past, present, and emerging, and acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded. We are on stolen land. In the ongoing fight for workers' right to climate justice, we must keep First Nations justice at the forefront of our minds. For without bringing justice to First Nations people of the land, we are truly never able to achieve justice for all. So as a high school student, I'm currently balancing my final year of school with my passion for the environment. My care for the environment started at a young age, recycling and picking up pieces of rubbish from my school oval. Little did I know that would be the beginning of an investment in a massive movement which is integral for future generations. So when I started feeling emotions for the environment, I was 8 years old, and I would see people at school littering, and I thought, no, that's not right. I'm going to pick up pieces of rubbish and do my bit. So I did that, and that could only get me so far. Then when I was in year 7, we had geography, and I started watching documentaries, and I watched Before the Flood, which Leonardo DiCaprio was in. I don't know if any of you have seen it, but it is very good. And I saw this film clip of deforestation happening in India, and I started bawling my eyes out, not realizing that this was climate change. And I asked my teacher, what is this? And she said, oh, Jazz, this is climate change. This is your reality. You're going to be growing up in a world which is going to be full of this. And I don't know how much you can do about that. So at the time, I didn't really know much about it. So I started looking into it, getting involved with it. And actually this time last year, then I joined School Strike for Climate, and that's kind of where my passion arose. So it's daunting to even think about what the world will look like in 10 years' time, with higher pollution rates, increase in temperature levels. We shouldn't be scared of the uncertainty of what is around the corner. We shouldn't have to worry about the unstable, unsustainable, and unsafe future. We shouldn't have to feel anxious about our government, who is supposed to be taking care of the average person like you and me. Our government who refuses to take action and refuses to prioritize our future and to care about us. A huge part of the fight for climate justice is also focused on workers' rights. We know that in prospect for a transition of any kind, it can be scary and uncertain. But if we don't transition now, if we don't start investing in renewables, the working class is going to be hit the hardest by the climate crisis. If opportunities in sustainable industries can't be provided for those working in the communities, a transition will not be possible. School Strike for Climate and environmental movements, such as the one we are with today, know all about this. The intersection between workers' rights and the environment is such an important part of our movement. This government's plan for a gas-fired recovery is a woeful attempt at a transition. It is a clear example of ScoMo listening to his climate change buddies in the gas industry, rather than listening to people with jobs. Despite what our Prime Minister tells us, a gas transition does not support people like you and me and people working in coal and gas jobs. From the time of School Strike for Climate's beginnings, we have joined you and many other workers in the fight, with one of our key demands being fund a just transition and job creation for all fossil fuel workers and communities. This is a bit of a promo for May 21, so have a little listen, see if you're interested. This year on May 21, we'll be continuing this fight, and we need you to join us. Will you stand up for equality and the environment and for First Nations people's rights? So on May 21 at 12 p.m. at Town Hall in Sydney and at many other locations around Australia, there is a climate strike, and you're all more than welcome to join. So I will talk about some of the struggles that I have had with climate change. So for me personally, I live in the Northern Beaches, which is a beautiful part of Sydney, and we have a lot of amazing beaches and bushwalks and things like that. And maybe November last year, there's been a proposal that has been put in place, and it is a gas plant, and it's called PEP 11, and it stretches from Manly to Newcastle. And that gas plant is going to be put in the water, and that means that we won't be able to go swimming, and we won't be able to do a lot of our favorite activities, which is around the beach. And this makes me feel really disheartened, because I've always been a big fan of the beach, and I know a lot of my friends have, and many families around the area are really protesting and doing things to try and stop this from happening. But unfortunately, the Morrison government does think that this is a good idea when it's really not, because it's not sustainable for you and I, and not for anybody else. So that is something which is really making me upset. And I've been trying to do all I can at my school and at primary schools and things like that to try and get a large proportion of people to come together and work together, because this is really not a good idea, because this is our future, and we don't want our beautiful, pristine beaches to be getting ruined. Alongside this, even though I'm a school striker, I do feel like a lot of people do have a lot of high expectations for us, and that is really hard to deal with, and that goes along with climate anxiety, because that is a huge amount of pressure which is put on us. And yes, like like the scientists, like Jonica was speaking about before, it's hard to know everything, and especially I think scientists would find the same thing, is that they're always being asked lots of questions about the environment, and it is sometimes really hard to answer those questions. But we do try our best, and what I try to do is to manage that stress is I try to go out in nature and remind myself that, like, I only have one life. I need to be present now. I can't be dwelling about what other people are saying about me and all of the other things, because I can only control what I can control. And I'm only 17 and I'm doing things that the government can't even do right now. So I'm thinking I'm already ahead of everybody right now, doing all the things I need to do. So that makes me feel a lot better. And also it makes me feel better when my friends and my family are supportive of me, because what has recently happened is my mum has a business, a salon, and it's a sustainable salon, which means she recycles all of the products she uses. And before that, she didn't really know much about climate change. And when I started with School Strike for Climate, she started talking to me, being like, oh, okay, I want to really know about this stuff. I want to invest in it. And she's my parent. So I was like, okay, well, I'm going to tell you all about it. And she was like, okay, I want to make change now. If my daughter's making change, I want to make change, because I want to make it a beautiful place for her kids, for her, for everybody. So she's done that, and she's made such a big change, and she's doing so many amazing things for the environment. So I'm just telling all you parents out there, if your child really wants to do something, let them do it, because they are amazing. Even if they're rebelling off the walls like I do. I don't go to school because I'm going to school strikes, but anybody can do it. And it is so amazing, because you all should just get involved with such an amazing climate movement, because we only have one life and we want to make it the best we can. What else do I have to say? Are there any questions that Susie would like to ask me?
Sure. Yeah, I'd love to give you a question from me, and then we'll have more questions from everyone later as well. So how do you cope with, like, when you read or hear about climate change projections, the ice caps melting, or you know, species loss or whatever? How do you help keep the joy and the positivity for yourself?
That is very hard, because it's always this like bombardment of news, and sometimes it can be fake news about climate change and things like that. But what I feel like I have to do is I have to take that information, kind of process it, and then I've got to think about the other side of the picture. So it might be as negative as possible, which is horrible, but I think, okay, what can I do individually? How can I make a difference? If that's like recycling, or if that's like spreading awareness about things. So I try to flip it around. Even though it might be negative, I try to really get myself out into the community and advocate and be like, okay, well, this might be negative, but think about it. If we're ending up going to like our 2040 target goals for zero emissions, we can do, there's literally a solid like 20 years to do that. We need to get together and like work as hard as we can to try and combat issues. That's what I would say is kind of working on your individual self, and then spreading that positivity with other people to create a cohesive unit.
Awesome, thank you. And
you're welcome.
Sort of related question is, like, people like us who are activists can get burnt out. It's quite common. We've put so much time into doing all this climate action work. How do you stop yourself from getting burnt out?
Yeah. Oh, that's hard. As a teenager, we get burnt out with schoolwork, and I get double burnout with this climate activism. I have had multiple series of burnouts. I just came out of burnout from like, I had a 5-week one of schoolwork and climate change, because it all got too much. But today I got over it, and I was like, you know what? If I'm burnt out, I just need to take time for myself. Yoga, meditation, stretching. I do dance as well. Anything that's active and gets me out of the house really helps me. Listening to calming music can be good. There's this really good artist at the moment. Her name is Montaigne, and she's going to be on Eurovision. And she has a lot of really powerful songs. And I like listening to them, because she has a lot about like climate change and activism, and they're really helpful. They have really nice positive messages behind them. So I always think to myself, okay, listen to something good, do something active, even talk to my parents about how I'm feeling. And that really, really helps with my burning out.
Awesome. That's such great advice, and lovely to hear you've
Mm.
got really supportive, awesome parents as well, because that makes
very great.
Oh, cool. Thank you.
You're
So
welcome.
thanks so much, Jazz. It was beautiful to hear your presentation. So yeah, we'll come back to you as well with some more questions after we hear from Susie.
Perfect.
So thank you. So everyone,
Thank you.
keep your questions, think of your questions for after. All right, so our third panel member speaker is Susie Burke, and we're really, really privileged to have Susie join us. She's really an expert in, she's a psychologist and has written many of the best resources for parents and individuals in dealing with climate grief and anxiety and talking to your children about climate change, which those resources she has shared and will share with you afterwards. So Susie also is a parent of one of the founders of the school strike movement, which, if you read Jonica's book, is founded the movement of the world, school strike, after Greta Thunberg as well, of course. But yeah, Milou was one of the Castlemaine school strike initiators. So Susie's got a presentation, some slides for us, and she's going to give us some really practical advice on how to deal with climate grief and anxiety. Thanks so much, Susie.
Oh, thank you, Susie. And thank you very much, Jonica and Jazz as well. And it's very nice to be following Jazz because, you know, as well as being awesome and inspiring, you've also illustrated a lot of my points. So I shall be able to refer to them and they'll all be fresh in everybody's minds. So yeah, just to begin, I'm talking to you from Dja Dja Wurrung country. We're in Castlemaine, where I live, and we are currently in the golden wattle and boomerang season, which goes between May and June. Wai Kulk and Datum Datum is what this time is called by the Indigenous people who've lived here for centuries. So I'm going to talk to you today as a psychologist and as a parent, as an activist. So as a psychologist, I work in private practice and I see a mixture of clients, but I also see people presenting with climate stress and existential grief around climate change, and I consult to organisations. And for many, many years, I also worked at the Australian Psychological Society, and there I was working largely on disasters, natural disasters, and on climate change. So I'm also a parent, and at this point I will endeavour to share my screen, so bear with me while I do that. So can you see this now?
Yes, that's good.
So, well, I've got 3 children and they're young adults and teenagers now, but this is a picture of my daughter Milou when she was 2, and we used to live at this eco-village called Friars Forest, which is near Castlemaine, and I ran a forest kindergarten there for my older children. She'd trail along in her gumboots with us, and we had other children in the area coming along as well. And at the same time, I was working at the Australian Psychological Society on climate change and disasters, and starting to look into the literature on children and how to raise children with environmental values. And there's some lovely work that's done by some scientists in Italy, where they look at these 3 stages of the development of environmental values in children. It starts off with children being in nature, so being able to walk, you know, on uneven ground, and then the next, you know, and just be in the nature. And the next stage is them being with nature, where they start to interact with nature. So, you know, they might be building cubbies out of sticks and, you know, piling stones up and moving around and, you know, participating with the things that they find in nature. And then the third step of it is when children then grow up to be able to be for nature. So it goes in, then with, and then for. And being for nature is when you are now interacting with nature in a way that you're standing up for it, you're protecting it. And that's the area that we're all looking at the moment. How do we be for nature, for the planet, and protecting the planet? I have to say, at the moment, I'm just grappling with, as my children are growing up, grappling with the question of, at what stage does one stop being responsible for one's own children's carbon footprint? And being somebody who's largely driven by guilt, I suspect the answer will be one never is going to feel like they're not responsible for their children's carbon footprints. But I shall come back to that point in a moment to illustrate it. Now, I have also... just trying to move this along. I've also been, over the years, developing the fine art of conducting family holidays on climate change protest camps and events. So this here is a picture of myself. I'm in the middle with all of my children scattered in different canoes, and several of their friends who we took away for Mother's Day in 2015 to go and participate in a blockade in the shipping channels in Newcastle. So this was my first family holiday in an environmental protest camp. And so this leads me to my other identity as a climate activist. And several years ago in Castlemaine, together with some friends, we were putting our heads together and trying to work out what would be some climate action that we could form a group around that would give us best bang for our buck. So we're all parents, we're all working to raise families, earn a living, but we're also deeply concerned about environmental issues. And so we decided that the most effective thing that we could do would be start a group that would teach people how to get arrested for standing up for the planet. So we started to train people in nonviolent direct action, and we formed this group called Central Vic Climate Action. So, in some ways, it's no wonder that then my daughter Malou, when she, several years ago, after she'd heard about Greta, got together with a couple of her friends in Castlemaine, and they knew what to do. They know that when you're concerned about something, first off, you go up to Bendigo and you sit in front of your federal parliamentarian's office and demand a meeting with them, and you get all your friends to come along, and you just do that day after day after day after day. And so they then organised that first climate strike. And so at the moment, I'm not really sure if I'm winning or losing on the carbon footprint of my children front, because when we left this eco-village that we used to live in and moved into Castlemaine, we said to the boys who were 5 and 7, right boys, we're not burning fossil fuels anymore to drive you around, you're going to have to ride everywhere. And so they became completely obsessed with bikes, and now all they want to do is be professional cyclists, and they've just recently both burnt an enormous amount of fossil fuels flying to Austria to compete on their bikes in Austria. So I'm not sure if I'm winning or losing at the moment, but it's an ongoing dilemma, how to raise children and how to try to bring them up with your values, and then have to step back and let them, lead their own life. And it's not about me, it's about, them and their right to live their lives in the ways that they choose as well. And these are, of course, all dilemmas that all of you on this call are going to be facing day in, day out as you raise your children. So the next point that I just wanted to make is, why would a psychologist be working on climate change? And I often get asked that, and I say, well, there's 3 reasons. The first reason is because anthropogenic climate change is caused by human behaviour, and as experts in human behaviour, that's something that we ought to be enormously interested in and concerned about. And the second thing, as Jonica has been covering in her book, climate change has an enormous impact on our well-being for a whole host of reasons, and therefore as people who are concerned about people's well-being, this is dead centre our area of interest. And thirdly, all of the solutions to climate change actually require widespread changes in human behaviour at all levels of society. Again, as experts in human behaviour, we really need to get behind that. So I've always been a huge advocate for our psychologists, getting involved in climate change. Now, I often run workshops on dealing with climate grief or the psychology of climate change, and I usually start off with this very horrible slide, which runs through a timeline of where we are and where we're heading, and or I might show this horrible slide of a whole lot of, recent magazine titles of doom and catastrophe, or I could equally show some slides of Scott Morrison in his recent poor performance in the recent climate talks, or as Jaz was talking about, this appalling notion of a gas-led recovery. So I could cover all of these different topics. And then I ask my audience, the question of how does this make you feel? And of course, people will all say, oh, crushing guilt and fury and dread and terror and grief and guilt and shame and all these sorts of things. And thank you very much, First Dog on the Moon, who I see who is also on this call. I have also co-opted one of your slides because you always illustrate the point absolutely beautifully. Fear, climate catastrophe, rage, huge wasps, grief, despair, eggplant, and so on and so forth. All of the consequences, some that we're more familiar with than others, as being, you know, the feelings and the things that come up when we think about the widespread destruction of Earth's life support systems. So it's clearly a really cruel and horrible way to start a presentation. And as a psychologist, it's particularly cruel, because I couldn't really care about it. But I do it for a reason. And the reason is because I'm wanting to make a point that knowing how the climate crisis affects us psychologically is profoundly important. It's because how people cope with their feelings and what they do next has enormous consequences, both for themselves plus the planet. And of course, people can deal with painful feelings about the climate crisis in a whole lot of really unhelpful ways. So they can switch off, or they can blame the Chinese or somebody else, or they can blame the government, or they can, I mean, you know, we love to do these things sometimes, but they can think that it's not my problem, it's too big for me, what can I do about it? They might just get all obsessed with you know, popular culture, or, you know, soap operas and things like that, and or they might just become deeply depressed. And all of these ways of responding are either miserable or entirely unhelpful, because when there's a crisis for us to respond to, it's way better to be able to find ways of coping that keep us engaged with the problem. And so this is what's been a lot of my work at the Australian Psychological Society, has been looking at how people are coping with climate change. So coping is a word that you'd be very familiar with, but in environmental psychology language, this is often what we call psychological adaptation. So we hear a lot about mitigation and adaptation around climate change, mitigation being the things that we do that reduce the carbon emissions that are heating the planet, overheating the planet. And adaptation is the things that we do to cope with the changes that we can't avoid happening. But psychological adaptation is about coming to terms with or coping with climate change, and it actually includes both adaptive behaviours plus also mitigation behaviours, because one of the ways in which we do cope with the distress of climate change, i.e. adapt to the reality of climate change, is by taking action. This is the second point there, the problem-focused coping strategies. So there are largely three types of coping strategies that people use, and this work has been done much by Maria Ojala, who's a Swedish environmental psychologist who focuses on children and young people and how they're coping with climate change, but adults use the same strategies as well. So she looks at the things that people do that are emotion focused. So this is the things that we do to manage the difficult emotions. So all of those feelings that First Dog on the Moon, thank you very much, talks about, and Jonica talks about. And those are things that Susie, when you asked Jazz just before about what does she do, she was talking about listening to music and talking to her parents and going outside and moving her body. So these are all strategies for coping with the, you know, in that example, Jazz, you were talking about when you feel burnt out, when you feel flooded with stress and worry, but also grief and, you know, all of the deep feelings that we have. These are emotion-focused coping strategies. And then the problem-focused coping strategies are the, you know, heading out to the May 21 strike, you know, going and sitting out in front of your politician's office, also riding your bike. It's the practical things that you do to reduce the carbon emissions, or to promote the reduction of carbon emissions in your world. And then meaning-focused coping strategies pick up on the things that we do with our thinking, the ways in which we change our thinking in order to cope with climate change. And so for young people, that's things like cultivating hope, so this active hope that Jonica was talking about. But it also might be about looking at the climate crisis and noticing all of the other millions of people around the world who deeply care and are extremely busy in, taking action and advocating for change and, inventing things that can help us make this urgent transition to a zero carbon economy. So another form of the meaning focused coping strategies is looking at the helpers and the heroes, people that share your values, that are doing something as well. And that cultivates a sense of hopefulness as well. And another example of meaning-focused coping strategies that young people use a lot is looking at how other enormous wicked problems have been solved in history. So looking back in time and thinking about what it must have been like for women when they were trying to get the vote and they were having to convince the men that they needed to be given the vote. These enormous problems that took decades of concentrated action but actually resulted in some profound change. Or the end of apartheid or the abolishment of slavery, all these enormous problems. So taking a historical perspective is another way in which we can use our thinking to be able to find a different perspective on dealing with the climate crisis that can both empower us and give us hope to keep going, plus can also, reduce the intensity of some of the feelings of fear and panic and dread that if they're too enormous can be sort of disabling. So in the work that I have done when I was at the Australian Psychological Society, I produced with colleagues a number of different resources, and so I just thought I'd flick through a few of them. So this was one that we wrote on looking at 8 psychological strategies that can help people to engage with climate change. So that's work for people that are wanting to have difficult conversations with people in their community or have got a particular project, things like that. And then these were a few others that several years ago I developed together with Bron Gresham, a climate psychologist, together with the ACF. And I noticed that Anna Seth was on the call today. This is something that she and I both find is an incredibly useful therapy when one's working in a therapeutic space around coming to terms with and getting engaged in doing what matters in the context of, the climate crisis. So this is a particular therapy that I use personally and with clients as well. And then, oh, dearie me, we've disappeared. And then there's these, the Cultivating Hope. So Jonica, this is a Judy Horacek cartoon that I think starts this off very nicely. So in spite of everything, I can't read it properly, you have to read it yourself because my picture is over the front of it. But there's this Norwegian environmental psychologist called Per Epson Stocknes, and he talks about these 4 different types of hope, some of which are more useful than others in terms of confronting the climate crisis. So there's these different types of hope, and he finishes with active hope, which is that Joanna Macy one that Jonica was talking about, skeptical about whether you will actually achieve a positive outcome, but you're going for it anyway, because to do anything other is unacceptable and immoral and, not what you're going to do. So that's that cultivation of hope. And this is something that I talk a lot about with parents around talking with their children about climate change, is how do you help to develop this perspective or attitude of active hope. And along the years, I've worked with a number of developmental psychologists who are interested in, the development of the child and the different skills and capacities that they need. And we've looked at the impacts of climate change on them. And of course, children are a particularly important group to look at because they're disproportionately at risk of climate change. They are one of the groups that are most vulnerable to climate change. But they also have a lifetime exposure because they are young, so they have their entire lives to be living in this climate-altered world, and this gives them a double jeopardy. But they are also those for whom the demands for coping and adaptation are most placed on. So it's the next generation who are going to have to adapt and cope the most with a climate-altered future. And but children are not just victims of climate change; they are also future decision makers, future leaders, citizens for way longer than we will be citizens in a climate-altered world. Plus they're consumers now and in the future. So it's of particular interest to be focusing on the needs of children and how to raise children, and how children and young people are going. Yeah, so we then conclude that how we raise children in the climate change world has major consequences, both for their own well-being and the well-being of the planet. And so following on from that, together with my colleagues, we developed a number of, two guide for parents about the climate crisis, and then this other document on raising children for a climate changed world. And I was just thinking about what Jaz was saying about how she'd had these many conversations with her mother and had been able to, alter her mother's views and knowledge about environmental issues. Because when we first started writing this guide for parents about climate crisis, we were motivated to write it because we were getting the sense that a lot of parents were unsure of how to and when to bring up the topic of climate change with their children, and were reluctant to do so. And we were concerned that they needed to do so, because as soon as a child is out in the world, and it's not just at home, they are going to be hearing about climate change, they're going to be exposed to it, and it's best for parents to be leading those conversations and for parents to be talking with children about what they know about climate change and how children are feeling about it, because we know that when children pick things up from the world, because they don't understand time and distance as in the same way that adults do, they can often have quite distorted ideas of what's really happening, and that can lead to a bigger anxiety that we could help them with if we knew that that's what they were thinking about. But as we were writing this, the school strike movement then grew, and we then realised quite quickly that it was now the case that in many families, it was the children that were more informed about climate issues, and that instead what our advice was to parents was about exactly what Jaz was saying, to listen to your children and to hear what their concerns are and to be open to learning from them, and also, exactly as Jaz pointed out, to be listening to what they're wanting to do as a way of taking problem-focused coping, i.e. action, and help them. Let them know that you're there to help them if they need help with some of their projects or their ideas, and that's an incredibly valuable sort of role that parents can take. And the other document that I've just shown there, Raising Children for a Climate Changed World, is where we look at the different skills and capacities that children need in order to have what psychologists call positive development as young people. So positive development in your early 20s is what we describe a thriving young person. And there are particular skills and capacities that they need to develop that line up very nicely with how to be equipped to be able to be flexible and live and thrive in a climate altered world. So that's that document. And as Susie said, I can send you a copy of that. And so there, just finished with this beautiful picture that I found. And I just wanted to make the point that one of the philosophers that we often quote in the academic papers that my colleagues and I write is a woman called Elizabeth Cripps, and she talks about how parents are hugely motivated to raise their children to be safe, and that she says that actually parents have a moral duty to protect the interests of the next generation. And she further makes the point that in fact parents might be the last generation who are actually able to protect their children's best interests by taking action on climate change. So that's sort of an endorsement of the meaningfulness of this group. Right, that's all I've got on my slide, so I should stop sharing now and get back to the group.
Thank you, Susie. That was wonderful. A lot of really practical advice there. So now I'm going to invite you, if you have any questions for Jonica, Jaz and Susie, to put them in the chat box, and we'll see how we go. We'll answer as many as we can. And whilst you're doing that, again, I'd like you to just take some deep breaths and tune back into your body as part of, being here in the present and reconnecting. So just take all the time you need to take a few deep breaths and post any questions that you'd like to. And I am going to kick off the questions for our panel, and then I'll come to the ones in the chat. So I've got a question for all three of our panel speakers. In the book, Jonica's book, the chapter about leadership makes what I think is a really powerful point, that our leaders, particularly the Prime Minister in the case of the bushfires and the climate change context of that, he and other leaders are denying our collective emotions about the bushfires and about climate change, and just pushing it to the side and hosing it down. And if we're lacking this leadership, we don't have a Jacinda Ardern or a leader like that who's able to talk about emotions and express them and empathise. What can we do instead, if we don't have leaders like that, to help our community to not deny these emotions and to feel them and face them in a healthy way? So who's got a response that would like to start? Susie, great, thank you.
Yes, well, we could vote them out. That would be my first suggestion. But the other more sensible answer that came to my mind was, the importance of, and it's one of my 8 steps in the Activate model, is to talk about climate change and your concerns with everybody that you meet. And I know that I do have a special talent for actually being able to turn a conversation about anything into a conversation about climate change, but I do think it's a skill that I would encourage other people to cultivate in themselves as well. Because when you can talk about your own distressing feelings, it actually enables the person that you are speaking to have those feelings in themselves normalized. It's normal to feel like that, and a feeling expressed and shared, as Jonica was pointing out earlier, is a feeling that is much easier to manage. So that would be my other tip.
Can I add something to that?
Please.
Because I guess one of the strong ideas that comes through the book is this idea of connecting through thinking about your heart places, or the people that you love, and actually framing your action for climate around love. So when you are communicating with others who might not have the same politics or whatever, like I've been on a 20-year campaign to convince my father that climate change is real. All the books I write are probably, and films I've made are probably to that end, but you do see change in your own family, and that's being replicated all over Australia, and that can give you hope. But there's another thing that, during the fires and the pandemic too, back to that problem with the news, it can tend to, and our leaders, it can tend to focus on the kind of people who are low empathy. Let's face it, a lot of our current leaders are of the personality type, which, dare I say it, okay, I'm going to use the word, it's on the sociopath spectrum, some of them. I'm not talking specifically about the Supreme Leader, but there's no doubt that some of the politicians that cause us the most emotional load are on the very low empathy spectrum. And we've got to acknowledge that can also contribute to the overwhelm. But what I remind myself, particularly during the fires and the pandemic, is that's not the majority. That's actually the minority of people. The majority of people are actually driven by this human desire for cooperation and connection. And we just have to balance that out in our minds when we feel depressed by those that don't fit that mold, that the majority of us are actually really caring. And this is where Susie's thing of looking for heroes, which I found resonated with me very profoundly. There's a lot of Susie in my book. So I didn't talk about that because I knew she could speak for herself. There's whole chapters where Susie is the main star. But I think it's so important, as I said, just to remind ourselves that the majority of humans are good people. Otherwise, we can get a bit overwhelmed.
Thank you. Absolutely. And Jazz, I'd like to hear from you. How do you chat to your friends about the emotional side of climate, dealing with the climate grief, and what do you find helps in terms of normalizing the emotions about it?
Yes. Well, I feel like a lot of within the School Strike for Climate community, I speak to a lot of other strikers who are like in year 12 or in many other years of high school, some in primary school. And we kind of usually, when we're experiencing a lot of emotion and heartfelt things about climate, we try to think about situations where we've felt empowerment or liberation through like speeches and stuff we've done in the past, and think about, hey, look how well we did. We got this many people to come to the strike. Or I spoke for my first time at a protest the other week, and I was like, oh my God, this is so liberating and powerful. I know that all these other people are on this journey with me. And the fact that it's actually okay to challenge authority and to do things which are really scary, and like you have to kind of live in the uncertainty and feel comfortable within that, because if you're not comfortable in uncertainty, you're not able to like really see your full emotions, you know, show. And it's kind of like we think about the positives, and even though it is negative, we think about moments which we're really proud of.
Awesome, thank you. And that's so true. If we're not able to feel our full spectrum of emotions from difficult to comfortable, we're not going to be resilient, are we? That's a great point.
Can I pick up on a word that you just used, Jazz, which is pride, that you feel really proud. And this is one of the new final chapters in my book, is actually in praise of pride, because it's this emotion that we feel when we've done right by our community as a group. And I think that being part of these group actions not only gives us all the benefit of that empathetic coming together feeling of doing something together, but it actually makes you proud of the humans around you. And that is so sustaining and so motivating and really moving, actually. And, and I feel sorry for the people who don't have empathy, who can never feel those beautiful emotions that we can all feel as we, take part in these group actions.
Absolutely. Susie, yes, back to you. And then I have a question for you, Susie, as well.
Well, Susie, I was reading through the questions, and I was just wanting to lead this conversation into one of the questions that somebody asked that followed on. It was a bit like Jonica, you talking about how difficult it is to talk to your father, and somebody else asked that question: how do you talk to people who are angry or disagree with you or have different values than you? And I just wanted to share some fantastic work that a social psychologist colleague of mine, Winifred Lewis, who's up at UQ, has done. So she's got this podcast series called it's not podcast, it's little YouTube videos called the Social Change Lab. And she's got some little videos up there about how to talk with people who are angry, how to have difficult conversations. And she makes this fantastic point about how important it is not to, I know I like to tell people that it's great to go and get arrested for standing up for the climate, but it's always in this non-violent direct action, and the idea of the non-violence is a really important point. So Winifred talks a lot about how to resist othering people and to resist falling into this us and them sort of thinking. And instead, when you're having a conversation with somebody who's got really different views on the climate with you, there are a few really clear instructions based in the science of how to talk with people that are really useful to follow. And the first one is to be kind and respectful. So to always be trying to, it's obvious, but it's hard, to try to be having this kind and respectful demeanor and way of talking. And the second one is to manage your expectations. So to actually lower your expectations of what you're going to achieve from having that conversation, because there's absolutely hardly any evidence that shows that in a one conversation with somebody who has a completely different view with you, you are going to change their mind. So that's not going to happen. Very rarely that might happen, but it's most likely not going to happen. And instead, what she sees as being a realistic expectation from your talking with this person would be to try to build a bridge of trust from your worldview to their worldview. And so another thing would be to be just openly asking them questions, so that you're open and curious about how it is that they've come to the views that they've got, and then to be able to share, and again, politely and kindly and warmly, I think is the word that she used, being warm and respectfully share how you've got different views, but look for ways of making a connection with them on some of the things that you do agree about, like you both might be parents, or you might care deeply about, the world that your children are growing up in. So looking for those moments of connection. And so, because all you're trying to achieve in those sorts of conversations is not to change that person's mind, but to leave the conversation with them hopefully thinking, well, that person was a really kind and open person, and they've got very different views to me. Because the most important way in which we worldwide come together to tackle the climate crisis together is to bridge this trust chasm that we have between people who are on one side of the conflict and those who are on the other side of the conflict. So anyway, it's fascinating work, and I really recommend you go and have a look at her little videos.
Fantastic, thank you. We're almost out of time, so just maybe finish with one or maybe two quick ones. Susie, there's a couple of questions in there about younger children. So what age is it suitable to start talking to children? So a 3 and a 5-year-old talking about climate change, would that be suitable? And then a related question from someone else is they've got a 5-year-old who's got climate anxiety and is actually being treated for it. How can you support children who are anxious about it?
Well, I mean, if we think about Jaz's story, Jaz, you were saying you were 8, weren't you, when you were already quite aware of environmental issues? So definitely, if you wanted to talk about it with children before they're 8, because you don't want them to get into year 7 like Jaz did and be told, oh yeah, well, that's what's going to be happening in the world, it's going to be terrible and it's going to be your future and there's nothing you're really going to be able to do about it. You really want to have got in way before that and had those conversations with your children. And so with 3 to 5-year-olds at that stage, a 5-year-old is now in preschool and in kindergarten, and they're probably listening. You're probably not aware anymore that the child is in the room when you've got the news on and the radio on, but and so you need to be obviously mindful of that. But with children that young, we're still in the realm of, giving them opportunities to fall in love with the world, to fall in love with nature. So that tends to be the emphasis there. That's that thing about being in and with nature. But certainly once children are at school, or when children are really being exposed to the news, you want to be asking them. You can ask them directly. You can say, have you heard about climate change? And they either won't have, in which case you might park the conversation and just go out and fall in love with nature again with them, if they're not out there in the world hearing about it in other places. Yes, or they might say yes, but they don't really understand what it is. And then you can pitch, your explanation of what it is to them. And then your other question was about, what about a little anxious 5-year-old? Well, the good thing about 5-year-olds being anxious, even though it must feel terribly miserable, is that it's actually easier for you as a parent to be aware of it and to be able to teach them the vital emotion regulation skills that they're going to need, rather than to have them doing it when they're 17 for the first time and they don't want to talk to you anymore. This is one of the things that I often say to parents with young children, is that, whilst it is really distressing to see a little person so distressed, at least you can be there to help with the helping them to name their feelings and to notice in their body when they're feeling their feelings, and to be practicing with them, holding them, and to be talking with them about what you can do when you're feeling, anxious and worried, like patting the cat or patting the dog or going for a walk or having a giggle about something, So, yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you. Beautiful, practical advice. So we are unfortunately out of time, and I don't want to keep you over time because some of you have kids to put to bed, is my guess. So
Can I just add one strategy that I know cover? Just a really one that you and I discussed before we had this session, but and perhaps this is for older people, but there's that transition from the late teens to the early 20s, and a lot of activists early 20s can end up with burnout. I think you, Susie, actually are a living proof of that, and the burnout can be quite severe. And one of the strategies that it would have come from Susie Burke and from other psychologists that I spoke to, of not personalizing the problem, of, and you can end up with this thing of thinking that it's your responsibility essentially to save the world, and then you just keep trying harder and harder and harder and forget to live your life and enjoy the beautiful joy and wonder of the world as it is now. But yeah, it's not everyone's individual responsibility to fix the whole problem. We do what we can, but we accept that what we can't do.
Thank you. Yeah, absolutely spot on. And it was a lesson I had to learn the hard way in my 20s. You're right. And it's something I still have to work on, and we all do, is that we are the people who take responsibility, which is why we're all here. And good on us, we are changing history, but at the same time, don't wipe yourself out by overdoing it, because we won't be joyful in our everyday life if we're burning ourselves out and never taking the time to enjoy the everyday moments. So that's something I learned, and my meditation practice helps me enormously in being present and being able to deal with whatever comes. So I really want to send a big thank you to Jonica and Jazz and Susie for joining us. I think everyone's really loved your presentations and your wisdom. Awesome. Jazz, you've got amazing wisdom, for year 12, like you're totally onto it. Thank you so much, and for all your work with the strike. Everybody, make sure you come to the strike with Jazz if you're in Sydney, but in every other town or city where there is one around the country. So we're going to post a few links in the chat here. We would really recommend you buy Jonica's book. And this is not a promo, I'm deadly serious. It's an awesome read for a climate activist. Like, it will really help you in dealing with the issues we've talked about tonight. So you can go to her website, jonicanewby.com.au. And then for the strike, we are all getting fired up at Australian Parents for Climate Action. We've got a guide for you on our website about doing a banner making event and getting together with other parents and meeting at the strike. Or, just create your own event. If you don't live near a strike, you can do something in your town or suburb, and post it on social media, do it out the front of your MP's office, whatever works for you. So the links are there in the chat to join that. And we have a climate action checklist also on our website, which is a downloadable guide to taking personal action and community-wide action. Simple, manageable, bite-sized actions that you can do today, tomorrow. So it's a free download, so you can go grab that off our website. You can also join a local group that we have many around the country. If you don't live near one of our local groups, Laura, who's also here, there's Laura, is our local groups organizer. She can help you start a local group if you would like to. And finally, I'd love you to donate to our organisation if you're able to. We're, a non-profit that runs on a very, very lean, tight ship. So every cent that you donate is put to incredibly good use to keep this work going. So the final thing I'd like to say is, as you'll read in Jonica's book about the school strikers, the Australian school strikers, Susie's daughter included, made history by turning that movement into a global movement. They took Greta's idea and they turned it went global. And so all of us are making history here by being part of this, and parents as well. We are making history, and we need more parents. So please invite your grandparents, parents, friends, everybody to get involved at the school strike, at the climate strike, or if not, just join our Facebook group, our mailing list, whatever they can do, because we need all the people we can get to make history go the right way. Okay, that's it for tonight. Thank you again for all our speakers, and thanks everyone for joining us.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Susie.
My pleasure. Thanks again.
It was wonderful.